Good morning to everybody in the courtroom. Could the registrar call the case, please?
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning. This is a case number IT 0588-2T, Prosecutor versus Zdravko Tolimir.
Thank you very much. We are still listening to you, Mr. Prosecutor. You have the floor, Mr. Thayer.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good morning to you and your honors. Good morning, everyone. Mr. President, we left off with the devastating effects of Directive 7's policy to make life unbearable for the Muslim populations of Srebrenica and Jepa. The evidence will show that while the VRS slowly strangled the enclaves, strangled that life and hope of survival out of them, the VRS never took its eyes off of an opportunity to mount its own direct military attack on Srebrenica in order to fulfill strategic objectives 1 and 3. What we have here is a main staff order from May of 1995. And we can see what its objective is from the title: stabilize defense and create conditions for their liberation. And if we look at the first paragraph, again, there's a reference to according to the information gathered. That means intelligence, and in particular, that means General Tolimir's intelligence. The Muslims are making intensive preparations for launching offensive operations from the general area of Tuzla, Kladan, and the enclaves of Srebrenica and Jepa, with the basic aim of cutting the territory of Republika Srpska, connecting the enclaves with the central part of the so-called Bosnia-Herzegovina, and reaching the Drina River. Again, which would impede the Serbs' strategic objectives of not having the Drina River as a boundary to their unified Serbian state. You're going to see during the trial follow-on orders from the Drina Corps based on this main staff order to do precisely that: mobilize the forces, get ready for combat pursuant to this order to liberate those enclaves in May. And then you will see also additional orders back from the Drina Corps up to the main staff saying, we cannot implement your order because we don't have enough forces to do so. But you will also see that the Drina Corps, always relentless in pursuit of strategic objectives 1 and 3, continued to modify its combat plan throughout the end of May with input from the main staff, so that they would be in a position when the time came to take that decisive step. And during this period of time also, as always, we have General Tolimir on top of the intelligence picture, trying to get into the head of the enemy, trying to understand what the morale, intentions, plans of the enemy was. And he issues his reports throughout the month, noting, for example, in May, a few days after this main staff order, that the Muslim forces from the enclaves in the Podrinje have continued reconnaissance and diversionary operations aimed at creating conditions for offensive operations, which they intend to start by infiltrating forces into the rear and the disposition of our units. Other significant preparations for this decisive attack on the Srebrenica enclave were taken at the end of May. You may recall me mentioning a few times this observation post Echo, one of the UN OPs, the southeast corner of the enclave, which was lying on a militarily significant east-west road in the area of Zeleni Yadar. General Tolimir paid particular attention to that early in the year, as we talked about on Friday. And you will see at the end of May specific Drina Corps orders going out to take that UNOP out, to take it out with force if necessary. And indeed, that's what happened. The Serbs attacked the UN observation post with machine gun fire, tank, and rocket fire, damaged the watchtower in the process, and forced those peacekeepers right out of that OP. And you'll see a videotape of a speech that the Drina Corps commander, General Jovanovic, gave on the 12th of July, celebrating the fall of Srebrenica and confirming that the attack on this OP had been the start, the prelude to the VRS's ultimate takeover of the Srebrenica enclave. Very simply, he said, and I quote, "At the beginning of June, more precisely at the end of May, we started to carry out preparations and then took Zeleny Yadar and tested what the expulsion of UNPROFOR with weapons looked like. Quite a lot of soldiers were involved, and as it turned out, that we had no casualties and no wounded. Then slowly, conditions ripened for what we did now." And you'll see that the importance of this military action was not lost on UNPROFOR, both because it signaled that the VRS was willing to use force, as they had seen before, against peacekeepers, and also that it signaled a potential future attack on the enclave as a whole. And of course, this attack disproves the lies you will hear General Tolimir, General Guerrero, and General Mladic tell UNPROFOR in the midst of the VRS attack in July, that we would never attack UNPROFOR. We hope UNPROFOR would never be our enemy. We're not attacking anyone. The evidence will be clear that when the UN got in the way of the VRS was willing to take peacekeepers hostage, to threaten their lives, to threaten to kill them, to fire directly at observation posts, at Dutch bat positions with machine guns, rockets, and tanks while peacekeepers were in them. And as always, you'll see that they knew just how far to go, knowing the risk that if they stepped over the line and went too far, the UN might invoke its ability to use air power. Again, the one weapon that the UN had at that time in the area, because the peacekeepers on the ground in Srebrenica had been so operationally undermined by Directive 7's restrictions at that time. There was nothing else that they could do but rely on close air support or airstrikes. And you'll see, as we near the end of June, more reports from General Tolimir, never taking his eyes off the enclaves. You'll see his intelligence reports focusing on their intentions, the impending combat activities, and you'll see him reporting before and after the Muslims at the end of June conducted some raids, sabotage raids, which resulted in the deaths of Serb soldiers and civilians. And you may hear reference to these raids, in particular on a village called Visnica, where civilians were killed by the Muslim saboteurs. But as the evidence will show, Your Honors, these hit-and-run attacks by these Muslim sabotage squads would serve really just as a pretext for taking the final steps towards fulfilling strategic objectives 1 and 3, which had always been there from day one. So we see by July that the VRS has made its decision to attack Srebrenica. What you have on your screen is General Jovanovich's Drina Corps order to attack the enclave. The code name for the operation, Krivaya 95. Order for Active Combat Operations number 1, 2 July. And you'll see that this order, like an earlier one that he issued that day, a preparatory or warning order as they're called, explicitly refers to Directives 7 and its follow-on 7-1. The Drina Corps Command, pursuant to those operations directives, and on the basis of the situation in the Corps, has the task of carrying out offensive activities with free forces deep in the Drina Corps zone as soon as possible in order to split apart the enclaves of Žepa and Srebrenica. Now, with respect to this objective of splitting the enclaves apart, we've heard that before. Sealing off the enclaves from each other so there could be no passage of men, materiel, make it more difficult for them to defend themselves in isolation from each other. And this was a legitimate military objective to ensure the demilitarization of the enclave. But we see that General Jovanovich, again, takes the extra step and orders that the army reduce the enclaves to their urban areas. Now, this necessarily meant forcing the civilian population into the very concentrated center areas of Srebrenica and Žepa. The VRS and General Tolimir well knew that this would create conditions whereby it would be impossible for the Muslim population of those enclaves to sustain themselves. They knew that this would replicate the humanitarian disaster of 1993. And they knew, based on what they saw in 1993, you remember the video, people clamoring onto those UNHCR buses to get trucked out in empty lorries out of that misery. People crushed to death, suffocated to death in the press to escape the hell of Srebrenica in 1993. General Tolimir and the VRS knew in 1995 that not only would they be replicating those conditions, the conditions would be worse, because in July of 1995, Directive 7 had been implemented with ruthless efficiency for months. And make no mistake about it, Your Honors, some military policeman manning a checkpoint, stripping a convoy of humanitarian aid, might not know any better. But the highest level officers in the VRS, like General Tolimir, they knew better. You saw those SFRY regulations, you saw the VRS laws and rules that incorporated the Geneva Conventions and crimes against humanity. They knew that targeting civilians was wrong. They knew that that convoy terror was a crime. He knew that every denied convoy brought the civilian population further to its knees, just like 1993, but he chose to keep moving that plan along. So by its very words in July of 1995, the Krivaya 95 combat plan, given the conditions that prevailed in Srebrenica in July of 1995, it must be understood as implementing Directive 7's direction to make life unbearable for the Muslim populations of Žepa and Srebrenica with no hope for survival. The departure of the civilian populations from those enclaves was therefore not a collateral consequence of that combat order. The decision to reduce to the urban enclaves and the departure of the Muslim population from them was a clear and clearly illegal objective of this combat operation. And we'll see in August of 1995, Your Honors, President Karadzic himself, again, acknowledging that this was about the strategic importance of Srebrenica and Žepa. Addressing the 53rd National Assembly on 28 August of 1995, and I quote, "We absolutely cannot let ourselves get any ideas about them taking our traditional territories from us. To tell the truth, there are towns that we've grabbed for ourselves, and there were only 30% of us. I can name as many of those as you want, but we cannot give up the towns where we made up 70%. Don't let this get around, but remember how many of us there were in Bratunac, how many in Srebrenica, how many in Visegrad, how many in Rogatica, how many in Vlasenica, in Zvornik, etc. Due to strategic importance, they had to become ours. And no one is practically questioning it anymore." Black and white, acknowledging that these were predominantly Muslim enclaves, and for strategic reasons, they had to become Serb. That's what it was really about. That's what Krvaja 95 was really about. And a copy of that was sent to the main staff. The main staff continued to follow that operation. And more importantly, for our purposes, you'll see how the main staff, with significant contributions from General Tolimir, neutralized UNPROFOR during this attack and facilitated the VRS's takeover of the enclave. So let me turn now to the attack itself. Began on the 6th of July. VRS tanks, artillery, aerial bombs, mortars, rockets, heavy machine guns pounded the entire enclave. You'll hear that the Dutch Bat Deputy Commander, Major Franken, stated that the shelling in Srebrenica was random, and the Dutch Bat was already transporting wounded civilians to the Srebrenica hospital. What we have here is an excerpt from a United Nations military observer report. They were known as UNMOs, the abbreviation. This is a report from somebody you'll hear from and see a lot of, actually, in the video footage. An officer named Joseph Kingori, who was in Srebrenica when the shells began raining down. And we see here, he reports a BSA offensive, again, BSA meaning VRS. He identifies all manner of weapons, artillery, falling on Potočari Township, Srebrenica Township. At least 250 artillery and mortar rounds have been recorded so far. Fatalities confirmed. Dutch Bat compound, rockets landing. And you'll see OP Foxtrot coming under direct shelling by the VRS. Colonel Kingori reported that several tank rounds were fired directly at OP Foxtrot, destroying the watchtower. And he later reported that an artillery impact killed a civilian and injured a boy. He said that when he was in Srebrenica, he would notice that the shells would fall about 50 at a time and then slowly sweep across the town and then back in the other direction after a pause in between. You'll hear that this shelling was indiscriminate, hitting civilian targets, causing injuries. And you'll hear, again, that Dutch Bat OPs and positions were targeted with all manner of weaponry. The entrance to the Potocari compound, constantly the target of suppressing fire, close fire, not right at the compound, inside the compound, but right in front of it, suppressing fire. It was obvious to the peacekeepers that it was meant to keep Dutch Bat inside its compound during the early portions of the attack. You'll hear that when the peacekeepers, a couple of days into the attack, were ordered to form blocking positions, that is, drive their APCs to a particular location in the south of the enclave as sort of a line in the sand across which, if the VRS passed, it would invoke close air support. You'll see that when those peacekeepers were sitting in their APCs in these blocking positions, they were shelled. What we have on our screen is an interim combat report. You've already heard me talk about the importance of the reporting, how that was a regular part of the professionalism of this army. And here we have from the forward command post, you'll see Prbicevac. That's a location to the east of the Srebrenica enclave where General Krstić basically had his command post for the purposes of this operation set up, and it also afforded a lookout of the enclave. So that's where he's sending this from. And you'll see right in the beginning, pursuant to the order of the GSVRS, again, that's main staff, Glavni Štab, and the decision of the Drina Corps commander to separate and reduce the Srebrenica and Žepa enclaves, combat activities around the Srebrenica enclave proceeded. He makes a decision for continuing the operations, continue the attack energetically, extremely decisively, with the objective of completely sealing off and reducing the Srebrenica enclave to the inner town area. And again, we're talking about basically a small network of streets and buildings. And he's, again, referring to the inner town area, reducing that population that had been living in and around Srebrenica to that compressed location. And you'll see during the trial, General Krstić actually does issue an attack order that night. Meanwhile, as we see from this report from the UNMOs, on the 7th, Dutch Bat is reporting heavy shelling around the Potocari compound. More injuries. More shells landing in Srebrenica. Kingori will tell you that one of them died at the Srebrenica hospital. He was personally involved. You'll hear from Colonel Kingori that he was out and about, and you will see him out and about. Somebody who was trying to do something about the horror he found himself in the middle of. The next excerpt from this report is dated at 1400 hours. Please note the UNMOs are observing that the VRS offensive seems to be steadily intensifying. Whatever their aims are, they seem to be concentrating more on civilian targets in Srebrenica town and Potocari. There are civilian casualties and unassessed damage to civilian property. When Colonel Kingori and his fellow UNMO had the time to count, they counted over 200 shells hitting Srebrenica that day. By the next morning, the shelling was continuing. We see here from this report, it started at 0800, and I quote, "They seem to be concentrating more on the densely populated areas and Potocari town." Again, targeting the civilians. You'll hear that on this day, the 8th of July, the Serb forces captured 3 observation posts in the southern part of the enclave, Foxtrot, Uniform, and Sierra, all in the general area of OP Echo that you heard about before. So you have forces moving south up towards Srebrenica town from the south of the enclave. And you'll hear that at OP Foxtrot, a Serb tank was firing directly at the OP, causing the peacekeepers to withdraw in their APC under that tank fire. And you'll hear that when they did so, there were some Muslim fighters nearby. And you'll hear that these Muslim fighters, for a period of time, put up some resistance to the VRS attack, were positioning themselves in between the UNOPs. So you'll hear that when this UN APC was trying to withdraw because the Serb tank was trying to blast it out of its OP, you'll hear that the Muslims didn't want these UN peacekeepers to leave, fearing that this would speed the collapse of the enclave. So one of them fired at the APC and ended up killing a Dutch Bat soldier. Now, it is in the afternoon of the 8th of July that General Tolimir and UNPROFOR generals Nikolai and Janvier begin having a series of telephone conversations about the attack. General Nikolai was a Dutch general who was based in the Sarajevo UNPROFOR command. He was General Smith's chief of staff. General Smith was commander of the UN forces in Bosnia. And during the attack, you'll hear that General Smith was actually on leave out of theater. So General Nikolai ended up having a lot of contact with the main staff. And you'll also hear that another UNPROFOR general, General Gobiard, a French general who was head of the Sarajevo sector of UNPROFOR, also had contact with the main staff. General Gobiard, of course, also served underneath Smith, but he was head of a separate office, if you will, that was based in Sarajevo. And you'll also hear conversations involving General Janvier, as I mentioned. General Janvier was another French general. He was head of all the UN forces in that theater. He was based in Zagreb. And he was General Smith's direct superior. So you have Janvier, Smith, Nikolai, Gobiard. Now, again and again, you'll hear, Your Honors, the conversations between General Tolimir and these UN generals would go something like this. UNPROFOR would tell General Tolimir, your forces are attacking. They're attacking UNPROFOR positions. They're attacking civilian targets, as was abundantly clear from the reports flooding in from all sources to UNPROFOR. Tolimir would then deny to whichever general he was speaking that the VRS was attacking anyone. He would make the counter allegation that the Muslims were the ones attacking and violating the prior agreements. He would claim that his information conflicted with UNPROFOR's. He needed time to contact his subordinate commanders or his superior, or to issue orders, consult with Mladic, that he needed more time to verify the information on the ground, but the information he was getting was wrong. In any case, you'll hear him repeatedly postponing further contact with the UN. And as you will hear, Your Honors, this was a deliberate delaying tactic that permitted General Kirstich's forces to encroach further and further into the enclave, advancing towards the ultimate target of eliminating the enclave, even as General Tolimir was insisting that they were not attacking. And you just saw that 6 July interim combat report where General Kirstich is talking about taking a decisive attack, pressing forward. So what you see here is a Drina Corps report. It's signed by General Jovanovic on the 8th of July. And this is going out to the Drina Corps, IKM, to General Kirstich, because General Jovanovic is now back in Vlasenica at the Drina Corps command. And what he says is, as we can see from the slide, the UNPROFOR command in Sarajevo has protested with the main staff over operations against UNPROFOR observation point, and he gives some coordinates. And that's OP Foxtrot, the one that you'll hear got blasted by the VRS tank, resulting in the death of that soldier by the Muslims. But that's what he's talking about there, this direct fire by the Serb tank on this OP. And again, the complaint is specific. They emphasize that their point was captured by artillery and tank action, and the main staff of the VRS answered that the Drina Corps command had informed it that the Muslims were using 6 armored personnel carriers painted white and bearing UNPROFOR markings, and that the Muslims had started offensive operations from Srebrenica in order to join up the enclaves of Srebrenica and Žepa. So General Jovanovic is here reporting what the main staff is trying to sell to UNPROFOR in Sarajevo when they complain. And again, there may have been some hit-and-run sabotage missions by the Muslims at the end of June, which may have been the last straw. But as we have seen, and as the evidence will show, this mission, this combat operation against Srebrenica had been in the works for a long time, and the moment had come. And again, the main staff, according to Jovanovic's report, accusing the Muslims of not demilitarizing, which they hadn't, and demanding UNPROFOR to get their observation posts in the right places. And then finally, the main staff has ordered you not to attack UNPROFOR, but to prevent any surprises and stop the Muslims in their intention to join up Srebrenica and Žepa. Now again, this is reflective not of some kind of humanitarian motives, but it's the main staff, General Tolimir in particular, because you'll see from the greeting here at the end, good luck in war and best regards from General Tolimir. General Tolimir is either at the Drina Corps command with General Jovanovic at this time, or he's communicating with General Jovanovic from the main staff. But either way, when we're talking about the main staff here, we're talking about General Tolimir, as we've already seen from the conversations. And this is General Tolimir, again, understanding that there's only so far they can go before UNPROFOR will call in air support or air strikes. They know just how far they can go. And you'll see that in the response to UNPROFOR, it's very careful. They can't deny that their tanks are attacking, because the Muslims certainly didn't have tanks, so they make counter-allegations and deflect what the real issue is. We just have here one of a series of protest notes that you'll see more examples of. General Nikolai putting into their files at the UN the note that he talked to General Tolimir this afternoon about the VRS attack on OP Foxtrot. Although General Tolimir promised that UNPROFOR and UN positions would not be attacked, now two UNPROFOR positions about 500 meters west of the OP Foxtrot have been surrounded by your troops, VRS troops. Those are the two OPs, Sierra and Uniform, which were in fact set up when the VRS blew OP Echo out that we talked about before. And you'll hear that those OPs were surrounded and the peacekeepers surrendered. At this time, we see the main staff becoming even more involved. This is a request from the same day on the 8th from General Jovanovic asking for the main staff to crank up its propaganda activities towards the enclave. We saw some examples on Friday of, again, Jovanovic reaching out to General Guerrero to try to encourage the Muslim population to leave, how to manage that in the midst of the horror that they created. And what we'll see here is that very soon, Lieutenant Colonel Milovan Milutinovic, who is the chief of the main staff's press center, is dispatched to Srebrenica, and he's on the ground. You'll see him present at the Hotel Fontana meetings and later at JEPA. And those were all filmed. They were filmed purely for propaganda purposes, and they were used to great effect by the VRS. And you'll see General Tolimir ordering loudspeakers for Colonel Milutinovic and JEPA when we get to that section. So we have the main staff further and further involved. General Nikolai, we're into the next day, the 9th, in the afternoon. The attack just keeps pressing forward. Nothing is stopping the VRS. One by one, you'll hear they would surround, fire at the observation posts, and that the peacekeepers would surrender. In some cases, they would surrender under fire and by threat of force by the VRS, and you'll hear that in other cases, they surrendered more or less voluntarily because they were afraid of being caught in crossfire between what few Muslim fighters remained and the VRS tank, machine gun, mortar, and rocket fire. And you'll hear that some of them were afraid of being targeted by the Muslims again, as that one soldier had been the day before. So we have General Nikolai getting more and more concerned. The troops have penetrated 4 kilometers into the safe area and are a kilometer away from the center of town. He's insisting that the VRS withdraw. And General Tolimir's response was that his information about the situation was different. Nikolai warned that Dutch Bat would now have to defend the safe area. And again repeated his request to withdraw. General Tolimir's response: he promised he would check the information directly on the ground, although he did not believe this was true, and asked General Nikolai to call back in 30 minutes. A little while later, the court's indulgence, you'll hear that General Janvier from Zagreb gets involved. Remember, Nikolai is in Sarajevo. Janvier calls the main staff and leaves a message. And you'll see this. And I quote, very simple message: you are to withdraw your soldiers who are on the offensive around Srebrenica by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. So we have another conversation with General Nikolai and General Tolimir after that warning is given by the force commander himself, General Janvier. Tolimir assures Nikolai that he had passed on the message to his subordinate commanders and that the VRS had no particular problems with UNPROFOR or the civil population in Srebrenica, and that the UNPROFOR soldiers were treated correctly. Nikolai is not having it. He's insisting on their withdrawal. He says there's going to be a strong warning issued, supported by General Janvier and Mr. Akashi, the special representative of the UN Secretary General. General Tolimir confirms that he understands the message and repeated that there was no conflict between UNPROFOR, the VRS, and the civilian population in Srebrenica. Again, turning it around, the only problems they had were those ones relevant to the BIH army, the Muslim army, in the southern section of the Srebrenica enclave, and to the BIH attempt to link the enclave of Žepa and that of Srebrenica. The BIH offensive taken from inside the demilitarized zone had been prevented by the VRS. It is the BIH offensive actions taken from the demilitarized zone that constituted the violation. Nikolai repeats that what Tolimir said has absolutely nothing to do with anything. He says their attack is threatening the civilian population in Srebrenica and was a direct attack on the safe area. And again, General Tolimir just keeps it up. Says that the Muslims were using heavy weapons, APCs. General Nikolai vehemently denies any Dutch-Bat APCs were being used, that it was false information. Nikolai warns that the UN was going to have to use whatever means it had to defend the enclave. So this triggers the following document from General Tolimir later that evening. This goes out at 2025, or we see a timestamp that it was at least received at 2025, the night of the 9th. It's sent from the Drina Corps Command in Vlasenica, the command post, which suggests, because it has General Tolimir's type signature, that General Tolimir was located at that time at the command. And that makes sense. Again, the main staff's preference for placing its generals forward so they can direct the action, influence what's happening on the ground. Here, General Tolimir is reporting on what we just saw. General Nikolai's request for withdrawal. And he's also reporting General Janvier's request to withdraw that we just saw a minute ago. And what does General Tolimir tell the commanders on the ground? I replied to the UNPROFOR commander that I was checking the information about the situation in Srebrenica and that their forces were safe. I anticipate talking to them in 40 minutes. Send a battlefield situation report every hour so that I can communicate with UNPROFOR, which will enable you to continue to work according to plan. And then again, pay particular attention to protecting members of UNPROFOR and the civilian population. I congratulate you on your results, and I wish you good fortunes of war. Which will enable you to continue to work according to plan. There it is. General Tolimir knows what the plan is. He's part of the plan, and he's doing what he can to buy General Kirstich and his troops more time so that they can finish the plan. He knows he can't put off the UN forever. He needs to tell them something. He needs to buy them time, and he knows an hour is a long time. So that'll give him some cover, but as he says, it'll enable you to continue to work according to plan. And again, he knows just how far he can go. He says, pay particular attention to protecting members of UNPROFOR. Blast them out of their OPs. That's what it takes to get them out of the OPs, but don't go any further. Later that night, you recall General Nikolai said there's going to be a strong warning in writing, and here it is. It refers to the VRS attacks, firing indiscriminately into the safe area, directly targeting UN facilities, causing several civilian deaths. These are the facts that are being reported from the ground to the UN. They've continued to fire heavy weapons into the safe area, 1 kilometer from the south of the town. Another demand to stop and pull back. And here, the UN is telling the VRS in no uncertain terms, we are setting up those blocking positions I mentioned a few moments ago with the APCs. The SRSG, that's the special representative of the Secretary General, Mr. Akashi, and the FC, that's the force commander, General Janvier, have decided that if this blocking position is attacked, NATO close air support will be employed. A little later that night, about 23:10 hours, we see an intercept. T here is for Tolimir. And I think in this intercept, we only get one side of the conversation. We only get what General Tolimir is saying. And he's saying, I got the message from the general's courier, clearly referring to the warning that was issued. And this is, by the way, an intercept between General Tolimir and General Janvier. So it's gone to the top of the UN command. He's saying, I got the warning. And again, General Tolimir repeats the mantra. Our army has very proper relations with the members of UNPROFOR as well as with the Muslim civilian population. Proper, very proper. And again, he turns it around, the counter allegations. The next thing is, General is probably aware that the Muslims have been attacking in the last few days, and they burned down some of our villages. Janvier has clearly repeated the UN insistence that the VRS pull back. General Tolimir says, I understand the general, but it is very difficult at this moment to make any movements since the entire area is an active front line. And he claims that at this moment, I can't even see the whole picture. You can tell from General Tolimir's next answer that Janvier is insisting that they pull back. Tolimir says that's particularly difficult to do when the Muslims are attacking on nearly all fronts around the enclave. I understand the general and I thank him. It's difficult to talk about withdrawal before achieving combat activities. And he's assuring General Janvier that he'll talk to General Mladic. And he insists that we are doing our best to stabilize the situation as soon as possible. Saying it's quite complicated, quite complicated. I thank the general and also wish to give him a personal message that we will do everything we can to calm down the situation and to find a reasonable solution. All right. Well, let's look at the situation and find out what General Tolimir really did to calm it down. Here's another interim combat report from General Krstić that night. And this is time-stamped at 23:20 hours. So pretty much at the same time that General Tolimir was just speaking to General Janvier, General Krstić sends up this interim combat report from Pribyshevac. And he starts off saying, on the 9th of July, our units carried out a fierce attack, thus separating the enclaves of Žepa and Srebrenica, carried out the immediate task and created conditions for extending the attack towards Srebrenica, and points out some of the features that they were able to capture. So General Krstić puts in his proposal, his decision, what he wants to do. Taking advantage of the success achieved, regroup the forces and carry out a vigorous and decisive attack towards Srebrenica. And again, this is at about 23:20, according to one of the timestamps on this document. So what do we see General Tolimir doing next? Having given his personal guarantee to calm down the situation, he sends this out. You'll see that this is coming from the main staff of the VRS, so this indicates that General Tolimir is back at the command post of the main staff in Crna when he writes this. You'll notice also the series of numbers at the very top left of the screen. Strictly confidential number 12/46. You'll see when we get used to looking at more and more of these documents that these numbers mean something. That 12/46 designates General Tolimir's sector, and in particular, 46 designates the security administration within the intelligence and security sector. So this is literally coming out of his shop. It's going out under his signature. And you'll note, if you please, also the timestamp showing that this is going out at 23:50 hours, or at least that's one of the timestamps that it was received. And you'll see that it's not difficult for General Tolimir to get back and forth from Crna Rijeka to Vlasenica. They're just down the road. Or Hampiesak, Cernavieka are just down the road. Now, he sends it to President Karadzic, and as we see here, to Generals Guerrero and General Krstić personally at that forward command post in Prvicevac. Obviously, Tolimir and his other main staff colleagues have been in contact and communications with each other because he knows General Guerrero is there. He knows to address this personally to General Guerrero. And why is General Guerrero at Prvicevac? He's there to represent the main staff. Mladic is somewhere else in the field. Guerrero is his man on the ground at Prvicevac to assess the situation, be informed by Krstić if there are any additional steps that need to be taken, what the problems are, to be able to provide guidance, and to be able to relate that information in real time back to the main staff. This is how the VRS operated. General Tolimir passes on this critical information that President Karadzic has been informed of these successful combat operations around Srebrenica, that they have achieved results which enable them to occupy the very town of Srebrenica. So General Tolimir obviously is getting very, very timely information about what's going on the ground. And he's relaying that to Karadzic. The President of the Republic is satisfied with the results and has agreed with the continuation of operations for the takeover of Srebrenica, disarming the Muslim terrorist gangs, and complete demilitarization of the Srebrenica enclave. And you'll note here that Karadzic has agreed. What he's agreeing with is the proposal by the main staff to complete the operation, to complete the takeover. You saw General Krstić's interim combat report. That information gets communicated directly to General Tolimir. It's clear that Tolimir has been in personal contact with President Karadzic, personal communications, or he has been fully informed by somebody else, perhaps General Mladic, who has. Because General Mladic must have approved this decision as well. And again, the President of Republika Srpska has ordered that in the follow-up combat operations, full protection to UNPROFOR, Muslim civilian population, guaranteed safety. You see specific instructions, maximum protection and safety, refrain from destroying civilian targets. And again, this is not born of some humanitarian motive on the part of President Karadzic and the main staff. They know how close they are to completing the objectives of Strategic Objective 1 and 3. They know how close they are, and they don't want to screw it up. They don't want the international community to be triggered, to be prompted to intervene by excesses. And Generals Tolimir and Guerrero are particularly attuned to this. Again, they are the generals next to General Mladic who most interact with the international community, most have their eyes on the military political developments across the world. And please note, Your Honors, how quickly this happens. Basically, within half an hour of Krstić's interim combat report, Tolimir has issued this critical communication to Karadzic, Krstić, and Guerrero. There's none of this fog of war nonsense that he's been throwing at the unperformed generals for 2 days. No, let me call you back in 40 minutes, General Kirstich, Mr. President, because I don't know what's happening in the field. This document, the evidence will show, is compelling evidence that General Tolimir knew all along during his conversations with Nikolai and Janvier of what was developing on the battlefront in Srebrenica. And when the crucial time came to make this pivotal decision, General Tolimir was able to move quickly because he had been sufficiently informed, he had the knowledge he needed, he was secure that this proposal from General Kirstich was militarily sound. And he was part of that proposal and approval process. Now, the attack, not surprisingly, continues. This decisive attack to take the town gets underway and stays underway. You'll see a conversation the next morning between General Mladic and General Janvier. Again, it's the same old song. I don't know what the picture is. I have to go down to the spot. I need to call you back. I have to talk to my subordinate commanders. The Muslims are attacking. We're not attacking anybody. Whether it's General Tolimir, General Guerrero, General Mladic, it's the same script. And we see on the 10th, more misery, more civilian victims. The number of casualties and wounded is increasing. UN APCs are being damaged. When they sent out a recovery vehicle, when the UN sent out a recovery vehicle, the recovery vehicle got fired on by the VRS. This report at about 1100 hours, 2 heavy shells, probably 150 millimeter artillery shells, hit the direct surrounding of the hospital at 1100 hours. All the windows are smashed, and shrapnel has showered the walls and rooms of the hospital. The surgery is very difficult to proceed. It looks as if the VRS are now targeting the hospital and the surroundings. And the shelling continues and continues. And from what the UNMOs were seeing, they estimated that the situation was going to get worse and that it was getting worse. And you'll hear more and see more reports like this. Peacekeepers seeing villages being burned to the south of the enclave. And again, during this period, when the blocking positions have been set up, these UN peacekeepers are being fired on. You'll hear testimony from these Dutch BAT officers. For example, an officer named Egbers, that at first he couldn't tell whether his APC was actually being targeted or whether it was just close fire or whether they were firing at something that was close to his APC. Bless you. But when he moved his APC, the shelling followed. When he returned to his prior position, the shelling followed him back. You'll hear that all of this shelling was causing, as the VRS had intended, the population to withdraw to the center of town. Colonel Franken recalled that there was massive shelling on the 10th. And he ordered his peacekeepers to stop counting the shells. And what happened at this point was the minimal resistance that was left from some of the Muslim fighters collapsed, leaving the Dutch bat positions completely exposed, which ones that were left at that point. So that evening, we see another intercept, 2015. Again, between Generals Janvier and Tolimir. And we see P here is the interpreter, the intermediary for General Janvier. T is Tolimir. So General Janvier is saying that to Tolimir that your units are attacking our soldiers. Tolimir says, I don't have such information. I'll try to reach them by phone to check. I don't believe our soldiers are attacking your soldiers, since they have been avoiding it up to now. That's just a lie. Again, denying that he has such information. He's going to check with his commander. He hasn't reported to me that there was any attack. Of course there was an attack. General Tolimir was instrumental in getting that attack approved at the highest levels. Again, General Tolimir doing what he can just to get the UN off his back. I'll establish contact, try to prevent a conflict situation. Janvier is insistent. He says to stop. And secondly, that they have to withdraw where they were before. General Tolimir says, I understand perfectly. Give him my regards. And I'm going to check. Call me back. 20 to 30 minutes. And as you can see here, General Janvier knows that he's getting the runaround. He says, as far as I understand, you were very talkative, and you were not capable of doing anything else. General Tolimir, undeterred, I understood you, and I'll check the information. You'll see other conversations. In fact, two other conversations later that night between General Tolimir and General Janvier, along the same lines. In one of them, General Tolimir claims that he has called a ceasefire, called a halt to the attack, and claims that the UNPROFOR soldiers were being forced by the Muslims to fire on the Serbs. He says he'd be happy to meet with General Gobiard the next day, the 11th of July in Sarajevo. But he says he needs more time. He needs to get more information. He says the Muslims have planted many rumors about the situation in the field. He denies again that the VRS is attacking, says it might be the Muslims, and suggests that Janvier speak with Mladic in the morning. So by the 11th of July, the town of Srebrenica was in utter chaos. People were terrified. They were collecting around the Bravo Company compound, the UN compound down there. And you'll hear that a shell fell in that compound, causing casualties, killing civilians. And then you'll hear testimony about how it reached a point where the civilians simply couldn't take it anymore. They had been shelled and shelled and shelled, compressed into this town, and they had nowhere to go but out. And so they decided to flee. If you remember, Bravo Company in Srebrenica town is to the south of Charlie Company, which was the compound in Potocari. So these civilians decide to try to make it to someplace safer. So they proceed on foot. A huge column of people, women, children, and elderly, wounded, grabbing whatever they can, in some cases nothing, just their lives. And they try to make it up to Potocari to safety. You'll hear that the UN, when they saw this happening, did their best to help. They sent trucks down. The UN peacekeepers that were in Srebrenica were told to assist and help escort. You'll hear from Colonel Kingori and other Dutch BAT officers how the shelling then proceeded to, in a way, funnel them out. It tracked this column of mostly civilians up towards Potocari, pushing them further up towards Potocari. You'll hear that the column itself was not attacked, but that the shells were falling on either side, and that people understood, they could tell that they were being pushed up to the Potocari compound. And at first, the civilians were placed in the compound, but once that got too full up in Potocari, they began to fill abandoned factories and other sites just to the south of the compound. You'll hear about the terror of these people as they arrived, their children screaming, awaiting some measure of safety, gathered in the open on these factory compound sites just south of the UN compound. And you'll hear that the close air support finally was delivered in the afternoon of 11 July. You'll hear that that close air support was immediately followed by death threats from the VRS. You'll hear that using a radio in one of the captured APCs, the Serbs sent a message from one of these, or through one of these peacekeepers that they had held in Bratunac, back to the compound in Potocari. We will kill your men, your peacekeepers, if the close air support continues. And they also threatened to shell the compound and the area around it where the civilians were if the close air support did not stop. Now you'll hear that Colonel Franken, the Dutch BAT deputy commander, at the time he was a major, you'll hear him say that he didn't take the threat to kill the UN hostages that seriously, but he did take the VRS threat to shell the civilians very seriously because he'd seen it done before. That's what had been happening the entire time, and he fully believed that the VRS was capable, 100% capable, of carrying out its threat. Now you'll see that there is evidence to suggest that General Tolimir is not in the main staff command post on the 11th of July at this time. It's General Guerrero who has now stepped in to be the main officer there. And you'll see conversations again between General Nicolai and Guerrero and General Gobiart and Guerrero, where this mantra is repeated. This is General Guerrero speaking, but it could have just easily been Tolimir. It's the same words. We have nothing to halt. We never did that at all. We're not shelling UN positions. We're not targeting the civilian population. And then, just like the threat that had been radioed in, General Guerrero, who's just a little more delicate, tells General Nicolai, in case General Nicolai doesn't order the bombing to stop, that's the close air support, and doesn't withdraw NATO airplanes, he will have personal responsibility for further developments and for the destiny of all people in the area. And you'll hear from General Nikolai that he knew what that meant. And he took that threat seriously, again, repeating the threat to bomb everybody if the UN got in the way with the only weapon it had. You'll hear that he and General Gobiard, because they took that threat seriously, they called off the air support. And that was it. And again, General Guevara tells General Nikolai, it's just Muslim propaganda. Now, far from being deterred by the use of the UN air power, you'll see, the evidence will show that the VRS pressed its attack even more. And we have General Guevara now communicating directly with President Karadzic, just like the evidence indicates that General Tolimir was in direct contact with President Karadzic on the night of the 9th of July. We have an intercept here between General Guevara and President Karadzic. I just talked to that General Nikolai. He says, stop attacking the UN. I told him that his information is probably from the Muslims and we haven't been attacking the UN. I'm asking him to stop the operation immediately and get those planes out of our sky. That's what they're worried about. Those planes. Everything is going according to plan. Don't worry. That's General Guevara to President Karadzic. Yes, yes, we'll try because they are a tremendous hindrance. It's just like General Tolimir telling Kirstic and Jovanovic on the 9th of July, I'll take care of tying up the UN. That'll allow you to work according to plan. A few minutes later, General Guevara again in direct contact with President Karadzic. He's reporting, President, Serbian silver, that no doubt refers to the old silver mines for which Srebrenica is named, the Serbian church, the Serbian flag. We see the critical communication link that the VRS main staff was to President Karadzic. And here, the intercept operator, the Muslim Army intercept operator, notes that General Guevara was the only one present today at the main staff. He calls it the Supreme Command headquarters, but you'll hear that he's talking about the main staff. And we'll hear that the lies just continue seamlessly. General Gobiard now gets on the phone with General Guevara. Again, denying, just like General Tolimir did, that UN members have been shot at. They were shot at by the Muslims. Our troops didn't open fire. The UN has never been, and I hope never will be, our enemy. Nor are civilians in that region our enemies. We'll do everything in our power to protect them. We have not attacked. The refugees who come over to our side will be totally safe. We will protect those civilians. Now, you'll see a document that's issued by General Guevara later that night, pretty soon after some of these conversations. And again, this is of a piece with the other instructions to be careful with UNPROFOR, obey the Geneva Conventions. General Guevara notes that in relation to the total situation in the enclave of Srebrenica, the monitoring of reactions from UNPROFOR representatives and the world public opinion indicates that the attitude of the VRS personnel towards UNPROFOR personnel and units in the area of Srebrenica is in the focus of attention. So he orders the troops, don't screw it up. It's in our hands. Don't get the international community involved. Remember that language from Directive 7. Do it unobtrusively. That's how we're going to do it. Avoid international condemnation. They knew how far they could go when the world was watching. And the evidence will show that these threats, the delay, the false statements, the lies from Generals Tolimir and Guerrero directly impeded the UN's ability to react to this military attack. It retarded their decision-making. It allowed them to complete the plan. And again, the Yunmos are reporting that as these refugees are streaming in, the shelling of the town has been going on despite the airstrikes. He refers to, at the end of this excerpt, the latest ultimatum given by the VRS is that if the airstrikes continue, everything inside the enclave will be bombed, including UNPROFOR and other UN organizations. You can't believe a word Generals Tolimir, Guerrero, Mladic say when they're speaking to the UN. That's what the evidence is going to show. References to the Geneva Conventions, the number of wounded is growing, severely wounded is growing. They don't have enough medicines because of the restrictions. We see how Directive 7 plays a tragic part, even at the very end of the life of the enclave, its final hours. The evidence will show that the Srebrenica enclave fell in the afternoon of 11 July, and you'll see video of General Mladic accompanied by some of his main officers, General Jovanovic, General Kirstic. You'll see the Chief of Security, Vujadin Popovic, who you've heard about and you'll hear a lot more about in a moment, accompanying him from the Drina Corps. You'll see the 10th Sabotage Detachment Commander, Milorad Pelamish, all of them taking this triumphant walk through the empty streets of Srebrenica town. And to give you an idea of what was to come, I want to play a little piece of video, and you'll see General Mladic turning to the camera and saying what was going to happen.
Evo nas 11. jula 1995. godine u srpskoj Srebrenici. Uoči još jednog velikog praznika srpskoga poklanjamo srpskom narodu ovaj grad i napokon došao je trenutak da se posle bune protiv Dahija Turcima osvetimo na ovom prostoru.
The time has come to take revenge on the Turks in this region. I see we're about a minute away from the break. Mr. President, if I could break now, this would be a good time.
Well, Mr. Thayer, could you perhaps indicate if you will be able to conclude your opening statement by the end of today's sitting?
That is my intention, Mr. President, and I will do everything I can to do that.
you should be aware of the fact that there is no courtroom available for another sitting this week.
Understood.
Yep.
I will comply.
We'll have a break now and resume 5 minutes to 11.
All rise. Veuillez vous lever.